Welcome to Doorways to Learning, where we celebrate the voices of educators all over the world who are dedicated to providing innovative and exciting ways to create learning environments, and who share their perspectives on what's going on in the world of learning. Today, we have not one but two very special guests for our winter holiday episode. Parents are also educators, and these two women are parents and very intentional teachers in different ways. They come from two different parts of the world and from two very different cultures. What they have in common is their willingness to explore how their cultures and the cultures they have around them have influenced their lives, the lives of their children, and the lives of the students and people they've worked with. A little note, these are two extracts from a longer conversation I had with both of these very special women. I wanted to present both of them in one chat because of the very different conclusions they have on multicultural living and experiences that will add invaluably to your toolbox of the knowledge of what's going on in the world. Perhaps in the future I'll be able to present the whole chat for both of them, but for the time being, I think you're going to revel in hearing their beautiful voices in these two extracts. We begin with Shelley Winterbor. Shelley is a teacher, parent, wife, and traveler, and most importantly, a person who reflects deeply on her experiences and how she can deepen her family's opportunities in the present and in the future. When you listen to her definition of education, ask yourself if anyone you know could have expressed it more expansively. Please let me know. We begin right off with Shelley explaining her overall interaction with education and where her formal intercultural experiences began in South Africa.
I grew up in the Midwest, and I went to all of my schooling was in the Midwest. And then after high school, I immediately went and got a bachelor's in organizational communication. And then I traveled the world for a bit. And then I landed in South Africa. And is this what you're wanting? Are you wanting me to share all this? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
This is part of your life and this is part of your education as a person. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I landed in South Africa with my husband, and I taught high school. I taught 3 different classes in 3 different grade levels in a culture that was not mine, with a staff with a different culture. So the students were Tswana and the staff were Afrikaans, and I was an American, English-speaking American. So that was quite an experience. And I did that for 2 years. And then we moved back to the US, and I watched my husband get his bachelor's, being a dad, full-time family man, full-time employee. So he got his bachelor's the non-traditional way, so went through that. And now I have children that are in elementary and have also been privileged to be on the governance council, so seeing the school from the inside.
Wonderful. So let's go back a little bit, because for me right now, I'd love to know a little bit more about South Africa. And I'm wondering when you were there. Was it pre-Nelson Mandela, when he was freed from prison, before he was freed, while he was president, or afterwards? That's my first question.
Sure. Post that era, he was no longer president when I was there. Mm-hmm.
So how was it working with Afrikaans? Because I did a lot of reading, but I've never been to South Africa. And I'm wondering, people, whoever you ask is going to give you their story. And I'm wondering what your story was about the diversity.
Sure. I think it's a beautiful country with rich heritage and diversity. I think that there's a lot of stories in the Afrikaans world as well as in the Black African cultures. And I think they like their stories and like to believe their stories. So it was very unique coming in as an American, not having much reference of either story, and just loving people and just being like, okay, let's move on. Come on. We all have a human heart, human experience. And so let's just teach these kids. But it was fascinating to watch the difference. I'd walk in the staff room and it's all Afrikaans speaking and that whole mindset. And then I'd walk in the classroom and it's all Tswana, Black African language speaking children, and just their viewpoints on each other and kind of being removed from it and being able to give perspective to both. And they actually listen to me because they love Americans and both cultures. So I really had a lot of influence inside the staff as well as the classroom.
What type of influence do you think you had, and why do you think that they, I guess you maybe idolized Americans or
Yes.
just appreciated the culture?
Yeah, they idolize Americans. My students would ask me things like, "Oh, have you seen Beyonce? And how heavy is her bling? Do you go over to her house?" So they just have a unrealistic idea of what it's like here. But as far as influence, I think because at the time I was in my 20s, I was young enough that the students could relate to me. And because I was American, it just automatically gave me credibility in their mind. They chose to have that credibility. And so I could really speak to the things that were happening in their life and world. Because a lot of them came from trauma backgrounds, which I did as well. And so I was able to speak to them and give hope, and they listened.
Can you talk a little bit about the trauma backgrounds? Are you comfortable about that?
Their trauma backgrounds or mine?
Both, whichever you're
Okay.
comfortable with, and you
Sure.
don't have to talk about either.
No, yeah,
Okay.
sure. I don't mind at all. So, um, South Africa is a mix of first world and third world. And so we had these students coming that were going to a private school. So it cost money for them to go with uniforms and dues. But a lot of them would live in what we would call a shack, like a tin structure that they've put together in, you know, in a community where there's a bunch of tin shacks. And so there was a lot of poverty there. And with poverty usually comes traumatic situations like, sexual molestation, physical and verbal abuse, neglect, abandonment, never seeing the parent because mom and dad are working 6 hours away during the week. So granny or auntie's looking after them. So there's a lot of neglect. And in that happens to come coupled with oftentimes trauma. Um, so for me personally, I grew up with a mentally ill parent, single parent. And so there was a lot of trauma just seeing things, hearing things, being exposed in certain situations, homelessness, a lot of lack of security of basic needs. I grew up in that. And so I could relate to them in some way. And here I am to them in their eyes looking successful. I take care of myself. I have a healthy marriage. I'm holding down a job. And so I could speak to things that are happening in their life and give them a perspective to give them hope.
What I find really interesting, and please tell me if my perspective on what you're saying is a little bit skewed, is that in South Africa, they're living in what we would consider poverty, and yet their priority is investing in education. And the same thing with you. You grew up in a very volatile, traumatic sort of childhood, and yet you invested in education. You found that as a priority. When I first became a teacher, it was in New Mexico, in one of the worst areas in New Mexico. And the education was the last priority. Mostly they spent money on their shoes or on their phones or whatever was really important to them materially, except for education. So I'm wondering what you think about that, both in their world and why you turned towards education, how you found sort of, could we say, safety in education?
Yeah, I absolutely found safety in education. I knew that if I wanted to make a life for myself at the time when I went in to get my bachelor's, that's how you did it. Everyone needed a 4-year degree to get on a desk, your name on someone's desk to get an interview. And so for me, that was definitely safety. It was also a way of I didn't know what was next, and everybody was doing that, and I could get loans to do it. So why not? In their case, every child has to pay for education. So it wasn't an option private school versus non-private or public. Like their public schools you have to pay for them and you pay for uniforms. And so sometimes there were kids that their parents didn't pay for education and they didn't go to school and they worked jobs at a young age. So that there is a difference between me and them in that everybody paid for school. I had students that were not meeting the requirements, and I would educate them on the importance of meeting the standards. And if you had a doctor that only knew 40% of the information when he was going to operate on you, how that would affect you. And so many of them would say, ah, man, it doesn't matter. My uncle works for so and so, and I'm going to get a job. And, now 15 years later, I see some of those students on social media just pop up and they're driving luxurious cars and luxurious houses just because of who they knew. And they knew that. So for a lot of them, education was not important. And there were a few that they really wanted to make something of themselves.
So, Shelley, can you just tell us a little bit about maybe the overall goals of these children, of South Africans in general? Maybe that's too much to ask, but can you give us your perspective about what motivated them?
Okay, so I want to speak to, I was in one small community, and so I can't speak to all of South Africa as a whole, obviously. So I have friends that are Black Africans, and they're CEOs of companies. They're the most innovative people I know, right? So I'm speaking about the students that I personally taught, and a lot of them, it was very tribal, it was very heritage related, and we're just going to do this, that mindset. It was just like, let's make it out of high school and not get pregnant, right? And so it wasn't really about the schooling. It was just like, this is what we have to do. But I would not say South Africa as a whole is like that. I think there's pockets, and it depends on exposure and as far as socioeconomic class, right? So obviously lower income, which is what majority of the students I was working with were, obviously for them it was more tribal heritage. It's just to make the grade and get out of there.
And then
Um,
their tribe would take care of them, basically.
yes, their tribe, it may not necessarily be like their culture, but it'll be their people that they're in community with will take care of them. It's who you know that I get this job. But as a whole in South Africa, I don't think it just depends on where you grew up, who your parents are, how much money they have, because the people that are like that are going to different schools, they're exposed to different levels of education, and they're doing amazing, incredible things in the country.
Yeah, I really appreciate that clarification because that could be any country, but I just wanted to specify since I'm really trying to find out more about South Africa and every country. Why did you finally decided to leave?
South Africa is very corrupt and unsafe, and my husband wanted to pursue a different career. And there's a mindset in South Africa that white men cannot make it. After apartheid finished, it kind of, there's a lot of talk that the power moved from the whites to the blacks, if I'm just going to say it like that. And so there's this viewpoint that that's the case. I don't think it is, but that's kind of the mindset of the white people. Like it's hard for an 18-year-old male, white male, to get a job. I don't think that's the case. However, in my husband's case, he's pretty specific in what he wants to do. And so he knew that what he wanted to do was more available to him in America. Plus, we had just been broken into. And so, yes, I mean, it's quite an unsafe living situation there. And he just didn't want to deal with that anymore. And we had the opportunity to be in America.
So, what is education to you?
I love that question. Education to me is freedom. It opens up opportunities that I may not have been exposed to previously before the education. I love, because I've lived all over in the world now, I love having education to expand my mindset, to really decide what it is that I believe about things. I think education gives us a broader worldview. I think it makes us uh, better in humanity, to give compassion and grace. I think it, like in a professional standpoint, if you need higher education, it does give you that opportunity to really pursue what you desire to do. And as a parent, I love education because our minds are available and want to grow and expand. And it's so beautiful to watch children's minds expand. It's so beautiful to see what wasn't a possibility or even a thought become that today. through education. So I think it's such a beautiful gift that we have as humans to have education and to pursue it. And it just opens up the whole world.
That was just a bit of my chat with Shelley Winterborough, but the best part, I think, every time I listen to her, I am overwhelmed with her sincerity and desire to make a positive difference in the lives of her family and those around her. Please find more about Shelley and her professional mission at Shelley Winterborough Coaching. I'll have the link in the show notes. You want her on your side as she adds a smell of roses all around her and can help you with whatever professional or personal interests you need strengthening. The second half of the podcast this week is with Damaris Acevedo, who now lives in Orlando, Florida, but it's a transplant from New York City. Damaris talks about the challenges she faced growing up because of the choices her parents made in wanting her to be natural both linguistically and culturally in two countries, that of the United States and in the Dominican Republic. Whereas in my perspective, growing up bilingually was a gift, Damaris explains how it can also be a struggle and was incredibly unsettling because she was navigating two worlds from preschool to secondary. At the same time she was trying to develop as a child to young adulthood, she had to take on the adult role of being the bridge for her parents and siblings for two cultures and languages. So translating and trying to help them navigate the societal differences. Damaris shares very honestly some of her challenges, and we begin listening to how she's going to write a book about her experiences in the hopes it'll help others move through multicultural and languaged families and neighborhoods more easily. So your book, is it about the struggles, the challenges of being bilingual? Because I find that angle fascinating, and I told you in the message why I thought it was fascinating.
I think there's a little bit of it in there because I did struggle as a bilingual child. So I would definitely put that into the book, but it's a lot of childhood experiences incorporating being bilingual.
Can you talk about that a little bit? What were your challenges being bilingual? Because I told you that I grew up in a family where learning languages was the best thing we could have possibly done. And so we only saw the advantages of being able to communicate with people in any language. But your sort of underlining foundation of your podcast and then your book is that there were struggles. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, there were struggles in reference to the fact that my parents did not speak any English. So we had to learn to speak both languages. When we went to school, we had one life. When we were home, we had a completely different life. So we did have a lot of difficulty with homework because we had to figure it out. It was, rewarding at this time. I see my life and I'm like so happy that I actually am bilingual and fluent. But growing up, it set me back in many ways. I had a difficult time in school. I was back and forth a lot to the islands, back and forth. My parents would send me back and spend with the grandparents and then come back. So that set me back dramatically in my language and speaking and writing. And I think, and I believe that it has affected me to this day.
All right. And so as a child, you were sort of the guardian of information for your parents. And that's a struggle. That's a lot of responsibility for someone growing up, especially when you're struggling yourself trying to communicate, right?
Absolutely.
All right. Can you tell me about that? Because I'm a teacher and I see children translating for their parents and I feel for them. Yeah. They seem to be comfortable about it, and yet I know they can't be. So do you remember some of the things you felt?
Well, it was such a responsibility to be able to translate something for them that probably was super important. So till this day, I still have to do that. So they feel like they come to us because they feel like they trust us and they know that we have more knowledge in the matter, of translation than they do. So yeah, it was a little bit of a challenge, or like it was scary. It was a little scary because we had to put ourselves in a place that we had to translate properly, to make sure that the information was, understood properly.
And you were saying about homework that you didn't have support at home during homework. And it's interesting because my sister sent her two children to a bilingual immersion school, and she speaks 10 languages, Damaris, 10 languages, and she doesn't speak Spanish. And so she couldn't help her children with homework when they got to a certain age. In the beginning, of course, It's not very different. If you know that many languages, it's not going to be too much of a struggle. But as you go on, she couldn't help them. But what she noticed was that her children became much more independent because they couldn't depend on her. Now, did you find that?
Yeah, I did. I found that we were a lot more independent because of it. We never even asked for help. We just figured it out. We would go to the library, and if we needed, like, whether it was an encyclopedia or just a book to learn, that's how we got through to this. There was no internet, so we had to do whatever research that way. But we figured it out. It really, I remember being in bilingual class until 6th grade because I was set back. The two languages really were very difficult, and coming back and forth from the island, they would send me like for a year, and then I was back with grandpa, and then so that did teach me fluent Spanish, but it also set me back when I would come back home to the America and was in school. I was never in English class until 6th grade. It was bilingual all the time because I couldn't catch up with the English language. And I think, like I said, this is the reason why I started the podcast, because I feel like it has given me that edge, like to learn a little bit more. I have to learn more. I have to kind of get my words out there and express myself better.
When I think of a bilingual class, usually I think of it as a reward. Like you got the lottery, literally the lottery, and you were able to get into a bilingual class so that you have more schooling. But it sounds like it was almost a punishment.
No, I think it was just the only way they can bridge the two languages for somebody that was back and forth in the Spanish language. So they were teaching me English. So it was bilingual only because they couldn't communicate with me 100% in English. So they had a teacher that would speak both languages. And that's what I meant by bilingual. Not that I was learning anything different. It was like a bridge to getting me to go into a full English class.
Was there a feeling of isolation in that class? Did you feel separate from the other students, or it didn't bother you?
No, it did feel isolating, and it felt like I was in a class of lesser, like I felt lesser than everyone else because everyone was already up to date except for this small group of kids, So when I finally made it to 7th grade, it was all English. But then again, I was still in the lower level classes in 7th grade because I was still my reading skills were not the same, they were not up to date. I was not at the right level yet. So it took some time.
All right. I'm really grasping this. It really is such a different take on it. I mean, I told you I live in Spain, and speaking English here is is everybody's dream. English is right now the global language, and to be able to speak English is very important for school and for work. And I went to New Mexico, and it's I worked with a lot of Mexicans, and they really did see it as a stigma. They didn't like speaking Spanish with people who weren't Latin. And I don't know, again, I would love you to tell me if you see this. Is it somehow you don't want to be seen in society, or that really isn't a factor?
For me, it isn't a factor. For me, I'm happy that I speak two languages because I'm able to service, multiple cultures in my industry, especially living in Florida.
Right.
But it's just like it's a preference. I'm gonna have to say it has to be a preference. I don't see it as a stigma. It doesn't bother me to speak other languages, but I prefer to speak English. Don't know why. I started speaking English as a child in school, in kindergarten, because I went to school here. But then as I was back and forth so often, that's when that whole thing happened with me learning my language, and then I had to go back to learning English again. So I don't know if it's a psychological thing that maybe that's the language that I learned first, and that's what I want to learn because I went to school. So I don't know. I don't know what it is, to be honest.
Yeah, and it also had to affect you socially, because if you're in the Dominican Republic for a year, for goodness sake, and then you come back, you have to make friends all over again.
Friends wasn't even the issue. It was learning how to read Spanish and adapt to their education. So now I'm here, I'm learning English, I'm good. And then I'm over there. And then all this Spanish is thrown at me. I don't know any grammar. I don't know anything. I had to relearn this. I had to relearn each language again and again the transition and the move was very hard because I had to adapt to a new way of education. They don't teach like here. It's very different.
No, I'm sure. I mean, even math in different countries is completely different. So it doesn't matter if you don't have help at home. They may not be able to help you because of the system, this educational system.
I would say that in reference to raising a child bilingual, I think that it's very important. I see a lot of parents now teaching their kids both languages. I wish I would have done that with my kids. I wish I would have been more involved in that. I was more interested in them understanding school. So I didn't focus on them, learning the language. I think kids absorb the language really easily when they're young. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I would encourage parents to do that, being that I made those mistakes. And my kids push it a little bit, like make it okay, make it part of their curriculum even. That way it's something that comes natural to them, and having another language is a great advantage. I mean, we know that, it has helped me dramatically and everything. So
I love it. All right, Damaris, thank you so much for sharing this.
Thank you so much. You take care.
You too. Talk to you soon. Bye. So that was our fascinating talk with Damaris Acevo. I am still amazed about her ambiguous feelings about her circumstances, how she grew up, because I would have loved to have grown up speaking 2 languages. But the more I talk to people, the more I realize that things are not always as transparent as they seem. And it's important for us as educators to understand what may be going on in the minds and lives of our students so we can act even more compassionately than we usually do. Because I'm not saying that we don't act compassionately, but the more we know, the more opportunities we have to connect more authentically and organically to our students. I really hope you've loved these 2 conversations as much as I have, and hopefully we'll hear more from them. Next week, we're going to open more doorways to learning. You are going to meet the incredible Ahmed Baba, who's been a journalist for most of his young life. And I don't say that to be demeaning at all. It's just that I'm twice his age, and I cannot believe how much he's achieved already in his life and how much more he has ahead of him. In his spare time, which isn't much, he uses his experience to give workshops on media literacy. It's something you don't want to miss, as media is a world that hides more information, ironically, than it presents. And we want our students to understand those traps so that they won't be fooled by them. So can't wait to see you next week for that conversation with Ahmed. And in the meantime, have fun in your classes and at home, and I'll see you next week.